Hello and welcome to your UCG PPP educational video. I'm Bromley, and with me today is Catherine, our very own church accountant and all-around financial answer lady.
We're grateful you've clicked on this video in order to gain some more background information before heading into the congregational listening sessions and survey process.
We have an important task ahead of us to determine the next step following our receipt of funds through the Payroll Protection Plan in 2020.
To keep or not to keep? That is the question.
Exactly. But in order to avoid a Hamlet-style existential crisis in answering this question, we're planning to lay out for you some background information, as well as several considerations in this kind of decision.
We'll start with the basics. What is the PPP? How did we as a church get federal money? And why did we apply in the first place?
To answer those questions, we'll travel back to those halcyon days of March 2020. Just kidding, those were terrifying days. But to paint a picture of the financial considerations before churches, and UCG in particular. Catherine will take the lead here because I wasn't even on the scene yet, not even a twinkle in the search committee's eye.
We'll also do a super tiny quick tutorial on how our church budget works, on giving patterns, and how our various income streams have been affected.
After that, we'll consider some of the primary objections we've heard to our participation in the PPP, which mainly center around questions about the relationship between religious organizations and the government.
And finally, we'll lay out some possibilities for next steps, looking toward a first decision at our May 2nd congregational meeting.
Are you ready? Then buckle up and let's go.
It was just over a year ago, at the end of February, when the health ministries team started to wonder about UCG's preparedness in the event that the coronavirus reached community spread. An ad hoc team was formed, and by the second week of March, the team was immersed in the nerve-wracking work of weighing expert advice, making contingency plans, and learning what terms like positivity rates and flattening the curve meant for our community.
Across the country, businesses, churches, and a host of organizations had to weigh a desire to shut down in the interest of safety, prevention, and public health against a very real risk to their financial livelihood. If restaurants weren't serving food, how could owners pay kitchen and wait staff? If theaters were closed and not selling tickets, how would the performers, crew, ushers, and all the rest get paid? If churches and nonprofits weren't passing the plate, or selling football parking, or holding benefits and fundraisers, how would they continue to carry out their work and keep their employees paid? In the midst of a rising economic crisis, of a looming increase in unemployment, would folks still have money to give to churches and other nonprofits?
As you know, I keep the books for UCG, and I have for 14 years on and off. I love this community and this church, and have since I was a kid growing up here. And it is such a gift to me that my professional work can be in support of keeping track of UCG's financial life. A church's income and expenses is both similar and different to other kinds of organizations. We have regular pledgers, but their pledges come in different intervals, annually or quarterly or monthly or weekly or randomly. We get income from other things like football parking and some space usage, and also from Sunday plate offerings. As you can see, here's a breakdown of where our money comes from in any given year.
Because we're a voluntary association, nobody is required to be here, and financial support is welcomed and encouraged, but not obligatory. The projection of our income is never going to be carved in stone. Sometimes people can't fulfill their pledges. Sometimes people move away. And our plate income always fluctuates, often with attendance. Offerings are bigger on Easter and Christmas Eve. And despite the secret desire of every church financial officer everywhere for all members to set up automatic electronic payments so that your money is here even when you can't be, electronic giving is still only a small percentage of our income. And that was especially true in March of 2020.
Yes, as you can see from this slide.
So you can see why we would be nervous about no in-person worship for the foreseeable future.
Now, in most years, our budgeted expenses often fluctuate a little also. In 2020, this was especially true. Our GRU bill has never been lower. We didn't have to pay a single overage for the use of our copy machine.
But the bulk of UCG's budgeted expenses, as of most church budgets, don't usually fluctuate, and those are in the line items used to pay our staff. When we shut down the campus, a number of our folks were not only able to keep working, but had to work more, gaining and using new skills. Your ministers have never video edited so much, while also juggling the increased stress and requirements of life in the pandemic. We clearly wanted to and needed to keep paying those folks. But we also employ a number of people whose jobs simply couldn't pivot in the same way, many of whom are paid hourly. So we, along with countless other companies and nonprofits and local businesses and churches, faced a question. Did we, in the face of uncertain church income, let those staff members go because they couldn't provide those services? Or do we figure out how to keep paying them?
I'll be honest and say that there didn't really seem to be much of a choice in the matter. It seemed clear that the wise thing, both on a moral and macroeconomic level, was to keep paying these folks. The question, though, was how? Would we be able to keep paying them at their normal rates if our normal income streams crashed?
Enter the PPP, the Payroll Protection Plan. When the program was first announced, I was grateful for it. I had been terrified to see so many folks losing their jobs as businesses and organizations made preemptive cuts, terrified for the economy, knowing how many Americans are one lost paycheck away from financial ruin. But I assumed that churches and other religious organizations wouldn't be eligible. When I learned, however, that the PPP explicitly and specifically included religious communities, I supported our leadership at the church I was serving at the time decision to apply for the loan. And I was delighted to hear in one of my first conversations with Andy that UCG had done the same.
The PPP application process was a challenge, but ultimately, what we were asked to provide was this: the cost of paying the salaries, wages, benefits, payroll taxes, and utilities for 2.5 months average. And that is what we were awarded, 2.5 months worth of salaries and utilities. The government hoped that this would be sufficient to cover the lost income for all sorts of businesses as we shut down in the hopes of lessening the severity of the pandemic. When we were awarded the funds, they went into the church bank account and were used to fulfill our payroll obligations.
I have to commend UCG and Catherine in particular for jumping on this program and submitting an application, especially when the news came that if we spent the money on payroll expenses, there was every possibility that the loan would be forgiven. It was such an incredible relief to be able to support our staff, to be a just and generous employer, reflecting our congregational values, and to remove from the table one more excruciating decision.
Fast forward several months. The pandemic, as it happened, did not end after 10 weeks. The Corona Contingency Fund, as well as other designated funds and budgeted community outreach monies, were dispersed to multiple individuals, families, and community partners hard hit by the pandemic.
UCG did see some decreased expenses from moving our life together largely online, but we also saw decreased income. We made it through the year okay, and indeed could potentially send an amount equal to what we were granted through the PPP back to the federal government. However, there's a little more to the story than that.
For most of 2020, we were not paying the salary or benefits of a third minister. Hi, Bromley. And the search committee team used far less of their budgeted funds than expected. Another example is that the 2020 approved budget included an intentional commitment to transferring $18,000 to our Capital Reserves Fund. Our revenue decreases meant that we were not able to do that in 2020. And the downturn not only affected our budgeted income, the lack of in-person services meant that special offerings, such as the Christmas Eve Emergency Loan Fund, also dropped without that physical plate being passed around.
We saw this continued economic uncertainty in our 2021 enlistment campaign as well. While many members continued to pledge as generously as they could, we heard from 27 of our regular pledging units that they would not be able to pledge in 2021, primarily because of COVID-related economic stressors. Others let Catherine know confidentially that they felt the need to reduce their pledge from previous year's amounts.
We were able to somewhat offset the loss of those pledging units by transferring the remaining search and transition funds to the 2021 budget, but we will not have that cushion again next year. We balanced our 2021 budget on the projection that the UCG campus might be closed for a certain percentage of the year, and we would see some lower expenses. But through our desire to be together, coupled with the wider availability of the vaccine, decreased positivity rates, and increasingly creative approaches, we are beginning to come back together. So too does our reunification have some new and increased expenses, especially when it comes to our technical and organizational capabilities.
So in short, we made it through 2020, but we're not out of the woods yet. Now, financially, the PPP provided a significant relief from one aspect of the pandemic stress on our congregational life, cash flow. But there are those who have expressed concern that it was not right for us as a religious community to take money from the government. So we're going to take a brief look now at some of the issues at play here.
Thomas Jefferson, at the turn of the 19th century, wrote of his support of a wall of separation between church and state, as codified in the First Amendment to the Constitution, which states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Now, having spent time with Catherine and her accountant geek speak, I hope you'll forgive me a few moments of nerding out about this. A good deal of popular conversation about church-state relations talks about that wall of separation. But in taking Jefferson's words out of context, we miss some larger points, as well as the fact that he's kind of an ambiguous historical figure, nevertheless. But first, churches and other religious communities are comprised of citizens. We exist in communities. Sociologists and political scientists talk about public and private institutions, but religious organizations, more often than not, occupy this middle ground, mediate between the two. Sometimes that mediating role looks like churches and synagogues running community programs with public funding. Sometimes that looks like ministers serving as mandated reporters and signing legal documents like marriage certificates. Religious leaders serving a public function within their particular religious role.
UCG has received public monies to carry out work to serve our community before also. County grants have helped enable the work of Read to Win and Food for Kids in the past.
When it comes to religion, the First Amendment has two stipulations. One, that the government not establish a particular church, and two, that the government not infringe unduly on any religious practice. Those are known as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, respectively.
At UCG, we have a history of protest and prophetic witness, and do not seem to limit our messages or actions to reflect the wishes of the government. We freely exercise our faith, and receiving these funds has not changed that.
The government, of course, does have a history of privileging white Christian institutions despite the Establishment Clause and its best intentions. And the PPP and the CARE Act, as with just about everything in this country, did seem to disproportionately help white-led organizations, and the application process was dogged by accessibility issues that made it hard for some groups to apply. That said, religious organizations were categorically included in the PPP, and nothing in the application stipulated that we articulate our beliefs or reflect any given system or religion or party's commitments. Non-Christian religious communities received PPP grants as well. The criteria for application were simply that organizations employ residents of the United States and projected that their income would likely be affected by the pandemic.
While religious organizations are obligated by our not-for-profit tax status to remain nonpartisan in all our efforts, it should be noted that we do pay payroll taxes And our ministers pay taxes on their income as well. We also, of course, abide by federal non-discrimination standards, and we surpass the minimum wage.
We perform particular religious work and have some particular religious commitments, but our continued place in the community and employment of individuals, there are roughly 35 employees on our UCG payroll, that serves a wider economic good as well. Now, over a year into the pandemic and with the closure of the 2020 fiscal year and the opening of the PPP forgiveness portal, which would mean that this was not a loan so much as just a grant of funds, the time has come for us to take the next step with regard to those funds.
Technically, we have used the PPP funds for the purpose for which they were to be used. We paid our staff throughout the first 2.5 months of the pandemic at the same rate we would have done otherwise, regardless of whether they were able to perform their duties. In fact, we paid folks well past that. Because of those monies, however, we have some funds which we would otherwise use for payroll still in our accounts, on the ledger left over from last year. Because those funds were given by members of the UCG community, we come to that community for input on how they should be used.
If the objection to having participated in the Payroll Protection Plan program is strong enough, we could conceivably use funds in our savings to reimburse the federal government, knowing that that draws down the sort of cash on hand we have as a safety net for our ministry and life together.
Mm-hmm.
Alternatively, we could establish a fund for these monies to be administered by a task force or an ad hoc group appointed by the church council, with members from congregational groups like Compassion in Action and the Board of Business, and representatives from diverse demographic groups. This particular working group could be tasked with coming up with proposals for those funds. Will we pay off the mortgage to be more stable in the future? Invest in upgrades to our property in ways that will enable further ministry? Will we contribute to the endowment, thus giving ourselves income later on for more ministry and community giving? Or will we just increase now our giving to individuals in need and community groups? Our hope is that this group could offer recommendations that speak to our congregation's myriad hopes, dreams, and commitment to doing good, today and for years to come.
So thank you for watching, and please join us for one of our congregational listening sessions coming up next week, or send your feedback to our moderator, Rebecca Beachy. We are looking to vote on this matter at our next congregational meeting on May 2nd.